Hello, everyone, and welcome to Nerding Out on Neurodiversity, the podcast for all things neurodivergence. I'm Dr. Matt Zakreski, clinical psychologist and professional speaker, and I'm happy to be your host through the wild trails of the neurodivergent world.
And I'm Jake Noonan, educational coach and humanities teacher, your co-host and producer, and I'm thrilled to help share the stories and the experiences of wonderful people in the world of neurodiversity.
We're really excited for today's guest, which we are going to say a lot because we're always really excited about every guest we get. So let's get into it. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Nerding Out on Neurodiversity. I'm your host, Dr. Matt Zakreski, clinical psychologist, professional speaker, wearer of many hats. With me, as always, is my co-host and producer, Jake Noonan. Say hi, Jake.
Hi, everybody. Again, so excited to be here and, have another wonderful guest with us.
Today's guest is one of my favorite humans in the entire world, and I hope she feels the same way about me because we're going to be spending all fall together. Let me introduce the wonderful and fabulous Andi McNair. Stop.
Oh, hey guys, how are you? Well, I'm so excited to be here, and the feeling is mutual for sure, Matt. I enjoy so much learning with you and being in the same spaces and getting to do this work that we're blessed to do. So I can't wait to share on your podcast and have this conversation. It's going to be a blast. So thank you for the invite.
Oh my gosh. You're a big get for us. This is like, you open a restaurant and then the chief food critic in town's like, yes, I'll swing by for a burger. Jake, are we ready for this?
I think so.
Not the case. I am looking for it. I feel the same way. I just always appreciate the opportunity to be in a space with like-minded people. I think we all know that synergy that happens, and it's just so good. So
good. So, so you and I are doing back-to-back state keynotes this fall, and we share a lot of those spaces. So can you tell our listeners what it is you do? What does that look like? And then we'll take it from there.
Yeah, I would love to do that. So my work is called A Meaningful Mess, and that is not by accident. I am usually just a mess, but every once in a while it turns out to be meaningful. So I was a teacher in the classroom for 16 years and gosh, loved that work so much, but got to a place in my career where things got a little bit dark. I always just say it was like the lights went out. I lost my passion for teaching. I started realizing that what I was doing in my classroom wasn't meaningful for my learners. And so long story short, I decided to implement this thing I had learned about called Genius Hour or passion-based learning. And look, for a traditional teacher to start implementing something like that was so uncomfortable and weird and it was hard. And while I had taken some risks in my classroom, that was definitely the biggest, and just absolutely fell in love with that idea and the impact that it had on my students and how it made learning real. So basically began to do this work around Genius Hour, developed the 6 Ps of Genius Hour, which is a process for passion-based learning. So between that work and then talking about just how to serve gifted learners well through things like the gifted onboarding framework and just things like that, the work that I love to do is to talk about how to give learners the opportunity to pursue their passions and interests, and how do we serve learners well in a way that is manageable and meaningful for educators. So I guess that is my work in a nutshell. I love it so much, and everything that I do is very personal. It's because of what I experienced as a teacher that I do the work that I do. And I always say I spent 16 years serving kids, and now I just want to spend a little bit of my career serving educators. I think like most of us, Matt, that's really our goal and what we want to do. And so that's what I'm doing right now, just hanging out, doing a meaningful mess, and getting to spend as much time as I can with amazing educators doing good work.
And as someone who's gotten to be in the audience for many of your talks, it is so inspiring and it's so authentic. People really latch onto it because I think it's something that any teacher can do, which is so cool. You go to some of these and it's like, well, if you have this $80,000 makerspace, right, then you can do cool projects too. It's like, well, golly gee, I have 3 staples and some chewing gum. Does that help? I feel like that helps.
We can make something cool with that.
Right.
We could, right? Come
on, Matt. Use your imagination.
That's what gets me into trouble. So why does this Genius Hour work so well for this population?
Yeah, I think a lot of it is that number one, I'm a big fan of Genius Hour for two reasons for the gifted population. One, I think it's a really cool way to identify giftedness because I'm a big, big fan, or I guess big, I don't know the word I want to use, but it's early. But I really kind of like the idea of leaning into not every gifted kid is going to be good at school, right? You're going to have kids in your classroom who aren't going to do well on a worksheet, who aren't going to pass a test, but they can go home and put a car back together, or they can go home and speak 3 languages. And I just think we have to say, like, that's giftedness too. And I think sometimes we miss that in the academic space because we're so busy looking for those kids who are, your high achievers and your gifted learners. And while that is 100% the case, oftentimes, not 100%, that I'm about to contradict myself, but while that is the case, a lot of times the reality is a gifted kid, we all know this, right? A gifted kid doesn't have to be high achieving, and a high achiever doesn't have to be gifted. And so I like the idea of using this type of learning to identify different types of giftedness and to honor that in our learners. I also think that for our gifted kiddos, using something like this as a way to serve them gives them an opportunity to, number one, practice so many of those skills that are important, I think, in the work that you do, Matt, like that social emotional work and understanding who they are and what their strengths are and also what their weaknesses are, right? Like where they need to grow and what they need to improve upon. And I worry that if we just focus on the curriculum that we want to cover or the things that we think they need to know, honestly, for this generation, I think we're missing an opportunity for them to invest. And I say all the time, like interest equals investment. And if they're not interested, I promise you, these guys aren't going to invest. And if they don't invest, that means that we as educators can sometimes feel like we're spinning our wheels. So I think for me, for the gifted population, it really is about helping them become more self-aware and to lean into who they are, what they need, and what their next best step is, right? How do I need to grow? What do I need to achieve? And who am I as an individual? And what can I contribute and make an impact on in this big world that we're all a part of? So,
I mean, and this really, I think, gets into that idea of universal design. The gifted kids are going to engage with this deeper and chase it further, and they may need it more. But every kid is going to benefit from this model, right? I mean, also, like not all gifted kids are high achievers. Not all high achiever kids are gifted. I mean, Jake, we have our bumper for this episode. Boom, done. Call it a day. So, Andi, let me ask you this, because you get to implement this all over the country, and I've seen it work. I've seen the passion in the audiences that you share with. I'm sure you've gotten a really great story of some teacher you saw work or pinged back to you and said, Mr. McNair, I did Genius Hour and this amazing thing happened. Like, can you give us a really great anecdote about a time this really soared?
Yeah. Well, gosh, I always tell my own story that it really changed my perspective on learning, that I started to see that it was like what real learning looked like. And so I think one of the best stories I can tell you is, I can't even remember the specifics. I know I had gone and shared on Genius Hour. A teacher had she was just getting started with it. So I don't know the end of the story, but I got an email from her and she just said, hearing you talk about how this changed your perspective of education and how it changed your learners' willingness to be in the classroom. Like, she was going to retire and she made the decision not to retire that year because she was so jazzed about doing something like Genius Hour and just doing something different. And I think the message there is that educators know what real learning looks like and they're hungry to see that again, right? That doesn't mean that we can't do what's expected of us. It doesn't. I do think there are some things that it's like, that's not probably manageable or meaningful. But I think that if we're honest, the people in the classroom know what learning looks like. And when those light bulb moments happen, when kids get excited, when the classroom is a place that both the kids and the teacher want to be, like, man, that's when the magic happens. And I worry that we're losing some of that because we're getting so focused on the things that we have to do. And so I think that, and then I think just hearing from teachers who say things like, I had this really difficult student, and this kid during Genius Hour, during the time that they're being given the opportunity to work on their passion project, it's the one time that they're locked in. Like, it's the one time during the day that maybe they aren't a behavior problem. And that's not the case for every kid. It's not a Hallmark movie, right? But for a lot of our kids, it does solve some of those problems. And so I wish I could think of like a specific story. I think the retirement story is one of my favorites, but then just hearing from teachers who are finding out that, number one, it's not easy, it's hard work, and it's uncomfortable for a lot of people. But once they get going with it and they start seeing the response of their learners, and they get that feeling again of like, oh, this is what teaching and learning is supposed to feel like. Those messages just make my day and make me realize that this work is so worthwhile, and that that it's not crazy to think that we could allow our kids to have a little bit of time to pursue their passion and purpose during the school day and appreciate the impact of that.
And I love that story. And let me serve with a story that I actually don't know if I've ever told you.
Okay.
So when I became licensed as a psychologist, I lived in Pennsylvania outside of Philadelphia. And I was working with a kid who, gifted kid, couldn't have cared less about school, ran the math, realized he needed to get a B- in everything to graduate and attend state university for free tuition. So he just did that and nobody could move him.
Yeah.
And the first time I ever heard your name was a teacher who had seen you. Of course, now I can't remember where it was, but this teacher from Philly had flown out to see you somewhere. And she came back and she knew I was working with this kid. She said, I want to do with this kid a passion project. I want to do Genius Hour with him because he's a brilliant STEM kid. He's a builder. He's a fixer. And so we all sat in a room and I said, what do you want to build? And he's like, nothing. I'm like, that's not true. Come on, you're 17. Are you telling me you don't have an amazing invention in your brain? And he looked at me like, well, it's dumb, but I want to build rocket boots. And we looked at him, we were like, all right, let's build some rocket boots. And he's like, I can't build rocket boots. It's a public high school. I'm like, we'll find you space. So the janitor let us use like the back barn.
Oh my gosh.
And as I did my weekly check-ins with the teacher, I was like, where did this idea come from? And she sent me all your stuff. So the first time I met you at Davidson, I was like, this is like the person in the flesh. And this is a kid who could not have cared less about high school and ended up winning. I have to hide this a little bit to protect their confidentiality. He ended up winning a major state award for his invention and didn't go to state university, ended up going to a really strong technical college. It didn't end up being rocket boots. It ended up being a sort of a hoverboard situation. But every time he got stuck, they went back to the 6 Ps and they found a way to get him unstuck and they played to his strengths. And this is a kid who could not have cared less, who used his own time to build an incredible project, which is why he's in a much more better fit university for him right now.
Oh my gosh, I have goosebumps right now. What a great story. Like those stories are everywhere. And, I saw so many of those in my own classroom with my kids who, I think about this one little guy who really, I couldn't get him excited about anything. And honestly, he was kind of like that student, except elementary version. When I said, hey, what do you want to do? He was like, I just want to like hang out. And I was like, well, that's not really going to work out because turns out we have to do some things while we're here. And he just dug his heels in for so long. And then all of a sudden he decided he wanted to build a solar cooker. I don't even know if that's the technical term, but that's what we called it.
Love it.
And I always tell this story that he decided one day that he wanted to cook hot dogs in the solar cooker. And I remember I had forgotten to bring the hot dogs. And he came in that day and he was so excited. And I did not want to tell him that I forgot to bring the hot dogs because he was kind of in a situation where I knew it would be difficult for him to get them. But I also remember him pulling the hot dogs out of his pocket and being like, oh, I knew you'd forget, so I brought them. And I always say, like, I have no idea where that kid got those hot dogs. Like, who knows? But for a kid who very rarely brought his homework back and very rarely invested in the work in class, to not only invest in building the solar cooker, but then to think forward enough as a gifted learner who sometimes struggle with executive functioning skills, to think forward enough to know, like, man, my teacher is a mess and I'm pretty sure she's not going to bring these hot dogs. I'm going to go ahead and take care of that myself. Like that's huge. And so I think those moments like that are what, when I get into a space where it's hard and it's like, oh, are people hearing this? Or is this possible to do in a public school? I just remember those stories. And gosh, Matt, I so appreciate you telling that one because it's those moments that it's like, this does matter. It's not just a cute little like, oh, let's do a project. Like it's bigger than that. It's about figuring out who am I as a person? What can I get jazzed about? And then how can I use that to make an impact on the world around me? I really do think it plays into Robert Sternberg's work on transformational giftedness, like using their giftedness for good, which I think is a direction we definitely need to go.
Absolutely. Yeah, as I'm fond of saying, it does feel like a lot of the kids we work with are like one bad day away from a supervillain story, right? So
Yeah.
like I very often tell my clients, like, we have to find ways to use your powers for good. And I got to meet Bob once and I like fanboyed so hard.
I bet you did. I would also.
And he wears like the worst ties in the world. And Bob, if you're listening to this, I was like, what is that tie, sir? He's like, I'm a grandfather. I can wear whatever ties I want. And that's true.
Do what I want. I didn't know a lot about that work. And he shared it in AGC, I guess a couple of years ago, maybe last year. Anyway, I started getting messages on my phone from people who were like, are you in this session? Like, are you hearing this? Like this whole idea of transactional versus transformational giftedness. I feel like the work that you do in passion-based learning connects to that. And the more research I did on it, the more I was like, I do think that Genius Hour passion-based learning plays a role in that.
It's almost like we're not finished products as adult professionals, and we get to keep learning and doing our stuff too. I mean,
yeah,
wild.
It is.
Jake, why don't you ask a question, bud?
So I had a question more so for all the listeners, since we're kind of, involved in the field a little bit more directly. We've been talking about Genius Hour and, the 6 Ps, but there might be a lot of people who don't know what any of that is. So
yeah, they're like, what would the 6 Ps be?
Yeah, are you able to explain that just for, the people who don't know?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for asking that question. So when I started doing Genius Hour in my classroom, I had learned about it from amazing people. Don Wettrick was the first person that I heard talk about it, and I connected with him. He was doing a class called Innovations in a high school in Indiana. But then I started doing some research, and gosh, Gleeds V, Denise Krebs, Joy Kerr, AJ Giuliani, Hugh McDonald, like those people had laid the groundwork for this idea called Genius Hour. And I started doing some research when I was in that dark place and wanted to leave education, and decided to start trying this. And so I did. And as I started implementing in my classroom, it just felt like really messy, like not a meaningful mess, like just I could get fired for this mess. But also at the time, you have to remember, I didn't really want to be there anyway. So I was like, I'm going to keep taking this risk because however this plays out, this is my last card, right? Like if this doesn't work out, I don't know what else I'm going to do. So as I started to implement it, it just felt really messy. And so I knew that for my kids, while this wasn't the case for everybody, for my kids, we had to have a roadmap. I always say the 6 Ps are not a checklist. They are very much a roadmap. In other words, these were the stops we were going to make along the way. When we made these stops, I'm about to tell you what the stops are. If you're like, get to it, I'm going to get there, I promise. So my whole idea was like, as we made these stops, I wanted there to be enough autonomy and enough opportunity for kids to do it their way. But I also wanted there to be some sort of system that I could manage, because I think that's what I would say. It just didn't feel manageable. So one night, I don't know how else to explain it. I woke up in the middle of the night and I was like, oh my gosh, every part of Genius Hour starts with the letter P. So you start with your passion. And at the time, I wasn't talking as much about purpose as I do now. So now I kind of think that first P is passion and purpose. So my students would figure out their passion. They would plan their project out. They would then pitch their idea to their peers. So I always think of those first 3, passion, plan, pitch, as like the prep for the project. And then the last 3 are project, product, presentation. So project is kind of like the verb, like that's when they're doing the work. Product is the outcome of the work. It's not always the expected product. Sometimes something doesn't go well, but I tell teachers, there's always a product. It may be a reflection on what they could have done differently, but to make a kid feel like because they don't have something tangible, there's no product for the work that they did is a mistake. So project, product, and then presentation. Ultimately, they reflect on what they've learned. They share it with others. They get that opportunity to like, hey, look what I did, and to think about the action that they took. So passion, plan, pitch, project, product, presentation. And those changed everything for us because I was able to help my students manage that process better. I was able to kind of know where they are. And now that I do this work helping campuses, districts, and teachers implement it, I'm able to really help them think through like what skills do you want them to practice in each part of this process? I think about the planning part and what an opportunity for kids to practice things like task initiation and thinking through what's going to happen before we get there. And for me, it's about the skills that they learn along that journey And then to hear them give their presentations and share, like, this is what I learned, this is what I did with what I've learned, is huge. So does that help, Jake?
Yeah, absolutely. No, it definitely does. And I can see, like, from a teacher's perspective, how important that is in the classroom.
Yes.
Like, there's way too many students out there that don't have the opportunity to just sit and think and figure out who they are, what they like, what they're enjoying, like where their passions take them, and then actually try something with it.
Yeah.
And like,
I agree.
It helps them further for, executive functioning, for planning, like you were saying. And it also just helps, every student. So I think it's awesome.
I think it's so funny that you said that about just figuring out who they are and what they're interested in, because when I first introduced Genius Hour, like, I thought my kids were going to be, I literally thought they were going to be jumping out of their seats. I was like, oh my gosh, this is what they've been waiting for their whole lives. I'm going to get Teacher of the Year. Like, this is amazing. And so I go into class and I'm like, you guys, we're going to be doing passion projects. You're going to get to pursue your passion. Like, what are you passionate about? And I mean, I had students who literally looked at me and said, what do you want me to be passionate about? Like, what do you want me to, just tell me what you want me to do. And that's how this is going to work. And in that moment, you guys, I realized that my students had become just as complacent and compliant as I had become. Like, we're just robots doing this thing. And it wasn't meaningful for any of us. And that was a big moment for me, because I could have chosen in that moment to just be like, forget it. They're not in. I'm not in. This is going to be too much work. But I think because of where I was in my career, and because I knew that if this didn't work, I was going to leave, I just dug my heels in and stuck with it. And I'm so glad that I did, because a few months later, a year and a half later, I mean, as we got into it and started figuring it out, I started seeing these magic moments in my kids. And it's addicting, right? As teachers, like, that's what we're hungry for. Like, that's what we want to see. And those moments kept me going for a long time in the classroom. So
I think that story hits hard, because by bleeding the joy and passion out of learning for our students, now they don't really know what they're passionate about, because that's not what school asks them to do, right? The school asks them to know, what's the capital of Texas? Name the last 17 governors of the state of Texas.
We'll only need to know this today, but
and then get rid of it from your brain, right? Because, like, you can't measure passion on a state test, right? You tell me, it's like, why would I take choir in high school? Choir's not going to get me into Harvard. It's not going to get me into Baylor. It's not going to get me into Stanford. And I'm like, but increasingly colleges are seeking the passion.
Yeah, they are.
They don't want the kid who took every AP, has a 4.5 GPA, but is, to use your word from before, Andi, a robot.
Mm-hmm.
They want kids who have a narrative, who have interests outside the classroom, because those are the kids who the research shows do better in the adjustment to college. Kids who have places to land outside the classroom, socially, emotionally, and following those interests and passions. So
yeah,
it's really, we're trying to, I think, almost deprogram a lot of the kids we're seeing.
That's a great way to put it. That's what I felt like I was doing, honestly, is that I was having to spend some time deprogramming them, because we spent a lot of that first year with them saying things like, am I doing this right? Or, when they would experience productive struggle, they wanted me to solve that problem for them. And I had always done that in my classroom. I felt like it was my job to, like, fix things for them. And when I had that kind of epiphany or that paradigm shift of, like, wait a second, me doing that for them is actually a disservice. And so as I started as a teacher to just be like, you know what, I'm going to let them just work through this. And sometimes, here's the great thing about passion projects. It puts you as a teacher in a position where you kind of have to, because honestly, some of my kids were working on things I had when I said, I don't know, it wasn't like I'm playing a game and I'm going to say, I don't know, so that you learn something. Like, no, I legit did not know. Matt, the conference we were at together, like, this kid came up to me afterwards and he was so excited to tell me about a passion project he was working on. And I just couldn't understand the vocabulary. And I was like, I'm trying to do the best I can to, like, oh my gosh, I'm so excited about that. And he walked off and I was like, I can't even get a mental picture of what is going on, because I don't know what he's talking about. But for them to watch a gifted kid who oftentimes doesn't get what they need in the system, to be excited about or to want to talk to you about their learning, I don't care what anybody says. When they come home from school and they say, I can't wait to tell my family, or I can't wait to tell whoever picks me up about this, that has to happen first. School has to be a place that they want to be before we can make school a place that they get the things that they need. And so even if passion-based learning plays a little bit of a role in like, hey, I can't wait to get to school today because I'm going to get to spend 30 minutes working on my project, or because I'm going to get to spend an hour working on my project. Okay, like if that's the outcome, school should be a place that kids want to be. And so many of our gifted learners, I think you would agree, Matt, that they just don't feel seen and supported.
Absolutely.
And what a great way for them to, especially those kids who aren't identified yet, for them to be like, oh my gosh, I'm finally being given an opportunity to show people who I am and what I'm capable of doing. And how sad that some of those kids aren't getting that opportunity. So sorry, I went a little on and on about that, but super passionate about that, obviously. Deep breath.
I don't know why you'd apologize like this. And I think you spoke to something that I was like, gosh, I hope we get to this. To the parents out there and the teachers out there who have kids who think they might be gifted, but maybe your district doesn't do the testing. Maybe you're at 933rd on the testing list, right? Like it's a New York deli, number 933. Passion projects and Genius Hour are a great way to awaken that spark and make sure your kid does get seen.
Yeah,
they're going to rise to the occasion in a way that is unusual and different, and is going to speak to sort of that depth and intensity of learning we see in gifted students, right? Like a lot of our kids can't show what they do because there isn't a time or a space for them to do it. Mm-hmm. But if those teachers are creating that time, then it's almost backdooring into that assessment space, because then we're watching a kid who, like, wait, I just sort of thought this was your general run-of-the-mill smart young girl who's like, so for my passion project, could I do a cold fusion generator? And you're like, yeah, that would be nice. Go ahead and do that, right? And now we're thinking like, maybe now we're seeing this young woman in a different way. How cool is that?
Yeah, that different perspective that we get from watching them work on their projects. And I think like I mentioned earlier, like you start to see strengths that you wouldn't have otherwise seen, because I think there's a great quote, and gosh, I don't know who said it, but there's a great quote that's just, you find what you look for. And I think so often in school, we're looking to fix. We're looking to like, what do you need to be better at? What do we need to fix? And sometimes I think we get so focused on looking for the weaknesses, and I'm talking about myself as an educator. I think that's really why I got to that dark place, is I had spent so much time looking for like, how can I fix this kid, or what do they need to do different, that I forgot to look for their strengths. And when I shifted that perspective and I started looking for like, what is in this kid that I can bring out through giving them this opportunity to work on this project, I saw things even in my gifted learners that I don't think anybody had seen, including their families. I talk often about family and passion projects. And I think it's a great idea for families to go through a passion project together, because it gives you a new perspective on each other of like, oh man, like you really struggle with task initiation. Like maybe that's why we don't do homework well. Like it helps you see the why behind so many things. So, but I also think, Matt, to your point that we were talking about, like students finding themselves in this, I think passion projects as a whole, once they learn the process, that can be something they lead on for the rest of their lives. I was talking to somebody the other day about college kids who get burnt out, and they're just doing school, and they're trying to do all the things. Well, that's not always a bad thing. If they learn how to do the passion project process well, they can always have a passion project running in the background. I met with a lady recently who is retiring, and we used the passion project process to decide what her second act was going to be, right? I know Julie Skolnick and I have talked a lot about, twice exceptional adults, and like how passion projects can really help you understand who you are, all of those pieces. So I think it's important to know that even learning the process itself, all of those skills that they learn are great, but just the process itself, I think, can be utilized through all phases of our lives. I always have a passion project going, always. And so I think that's important to remember as well.
And really the neuroscience behind this is so interesting, because we live in a very extrinsic motivation society, right? Like we get the dopamine that fuels the thing because it's like you did the thing, you got the thing done, you got an A on it, rinse, wash, repeat. Mm-hmm. But projects, right, where you're going to start a project that you might not see the benefit from for weeks, months, maybe years. I feel like I started my book 2 years ago, and it's like it comes out in less than 2 weeks, and it's like,
Oh, so exciting.
If I wasn't passionate about this, I wouldn't have done it. I would have quit a million times.
Yep.
But it came from a place of intrinsic motivation. So I kept.
Oh gosh, that's so good, because that's what passion projects operate on. If I had to say, like, what's the fuel for a passion project? And gosh, I've never thought about it that way, but the fuel for a passion project is intrinsic motivation. And the fuel for so much of what kids do at school has to be that extrinsic motivation that honestly, you're going to be puttering around really soon. It's not going to last very long, right? You're going to have to stop and plug in really fast. But I think that for our gifted learners, so much of that is extrinsic. Like I'm performing for grades, I'm performing for an outcome, I'm doing these things so that this looks good. But passion projects aren't that. It runs on intrinsic motivation. And I think that's something we have to remember as we're working through it, not to fall into that. It really is just about action instead of information. So that, by the way, is oftentimes how I explain to people the difference between a research project and a passion project, because a lot of people get that wrong. Like, I'll meet with somebody and they'll say, we're just not getting the same outcomes that you got with Genius Hour. And I'll say, well, what are the outcomes that you're getting? And then tell me how you're doing it. And as they tell me what they're doing, I always have to say, like, well, you're getting the outcomes of a research project because you're doing a research project. Like, they're different. And the way that they're different is with a research project, the outcome is information. With a Genius Hour project, the outcome is action. And so neither are wrong, but it's important to know what outcome you want and what you need.
I mean, Andy, do you ever make t-shirts? We should put that on a t-shirt, honestly. Like, I would happily wear that.
I'll have to get you one and bring it to Alabama.
I'll be like at a football game, like, woo! Probably better than painting my chest.
Yeah, probably so.
Jake, you're much more in the education space than I am, right? I mean, so like, I'm watching your brain like spin on this, like the hamster wheel is like, do you see yourself using this with your kids? I mean, what do you think that's going to look like for you?
So I had like a weird experience with it where hearing you talk about it, Andy, like I realized that I was already doing all of these things naturally, like through the classroom.
Oh, that's awesome.
Because like for me personally, I never liked the traditional teaching model. I've gotten in some trouble here and there because I don't tend to follow the curriculum to a T, and I'd rather, add some more fun things and have the kids get some more buy-in and
imagine that,
participate in their education a little bit more. So just like hearing that it's something that you're trying to spread more in a sense to the broader education world, I think is incredible, because I wish more teachers were able to do that and more teachers actually focused on the deeper parts of the learning, like the intrinsic motivators, rather than the, you're going to get a grade on this or you have to do this because what about college, 10, 15 years down the road, this 1A is going to be the thing that gets you in there. Like they don't really care.
Don't care.
The ones that do, they're just going to get burnt out and stressed out further and further along. And we're just doing them, like you were saying, more of a disservice than anything.
Yeah. I always share this one analogy of like going to the grocery store, and that if somebody was there and they were just putting random things in your basket, you would probably put those things back on the shelf. And I think that's what teaching feels like. I think we spend all day putting things in kids' baskets, and then we turn around at the checkout line, AKA when they go to take the test, and you're like, where's all that stuff that I put in your basket all day? And they're like, oh, I put that back on the shelf. I don't even need it, right? And you're like, no, like you're going to need that later. Like a year from now, you're going to run out of sugar. And they're like, I do not care. If I run out of sugar a year from now, I'll come back to the store, because you're working with a generation of kids who have access to information at their fingertips. And so I think if you just change that analogy a little bit and you say, what if that person said, hey, Andy, I'm going to put sugar in your basket because your husband loves sweet tea and you're almost out of sugar. Or, hey, I'm going to put pancake syrup in your basket. I live in Texas, by the way, so these analogies are very, but I live in Texas. And so I don't know why I just said that. You may have to cut that out. Let me get back. If they say, hey, I'm going to put sugar in your basket because your husband loves sweet tea and you're almost out of sugar, or I'm going to put syrup in your basket because you're feeding the football team a pancake dinner on Friday night and you don't have any syrup, I would be much more willing to keep those things in my basket because I know how I'm going to use them tomorrow, right? And so I think that's what educators have to understand with this generation of learners. Because of that instant access to information, if we're going to put something in their basket, they have to know how they're going to use it right now. It can't be, you're going to need sugar in a year, because they're just going to put it back on the shelf. And honestly, I think that not getting a return on their investment and teachers feeling like they're putting things back on the shelf is a big reason that we're losing teachers right now. I know there's so many more reasons, but it's one of the reasons. If I don't feel like I'm getting a return on my investment, or they're not keeping what I'm giving them, I'm 100% going to go find something more meaningful to do. And what's so sad is there's nothing more meaningful to do than a teaching career. And yet we have teachers leaving it because they can't find meaning in it. And that's because, Jake, I think what you said, like so many of them don't feel that freedom and autonomy to do what they know is best for their learners. And so I think passion projects are just a small way to make that happen.
Wow. Oh, I love it so much. And it's funny, like so much of how we burn our kids out is when we arbitrarily decide this is what you're going to do.
Mm-hmm.
When I do family therapy with families around like chores, I'm like, so what chores do your kids do? Like, oh, they take out the garbage. I'm like, cool. Does your kid want to do that? Like, well, no kid wants to do chores. That's probably true. But does your kid want to take out the garbage?
Mm-hmm.
Parents look at me like, well, I never thought to ask. It's like, maybe we should, because, maybe your kid's got sensory needs and the idea of taking out the garbage gives them the willy. So they fight you tooth and nail on it every Sunday night.
Mm-hmm.
But that same kid would love the sensory experience of washing dishes in some warm soapy water.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
That's good. Yeah.
And there's no right way to parent, just like there's no right way to teach. But the best practices come from interest and communication and treating the person across the table from you like they matter.
Mm-hmm. Oh, it's so good. And you can make me a t-shirt that says that. How about that?
Hey, t-shirts.
T-shirts for
Hey, call
everyone.
a t-shirt guy.
Take it your turn. Give us a t-shirt.
I do know a t-shirt, people, just saying.
Oh, my goodness.
It can happen. I think that's so huge. And one of the things that I love most about passion projects is that it does enough. It gives your kids enough of an opportunity to do the things that they want to do and the things that they're interested in, so that when you do have to push them and you do have to challenge them to do something that they may be not so excited about, or something that they don't want to do, it feels more like a partnership. It's not just a give, or it's not just a take, right? Now I'm giving a little, right? I'm giving you this opportunity. And so when I do have to get you to do something that I need you to do, at least there's a give and take there, and not just kids come to school and do what we tell them to do every day, all day. And honestly, to be honest, if we're going to keep doing this, and school is always going to be a place where students are told what to do, when to do, how to do, and where to do, we can't be surprised when that doesn't happen. They just don't do, right? Because they've been trained that that's what learning looks like. And so many of our kids, even when they get to college or into their career, they need somebody to say step by step, here's what you do, not because they're lazy, not because they're not just as smart as every generation before, but because they have been trained to think that that's what it looks like. So I always say, when people say to me like, gosh, this generation is so spoon-fed and so coddled, I always say, like, here's the funny thing. Those are two things that are done to you. So if we don't want them to be spoon-fed and coddled, there's a real easy fix for that. You just stop spoon-feeding and coddling them. Yes. So I think sometimes this generation gets a bad rap when the reality is they're just responding to what things look like for them. Look, there's a lot of things they can learn from us, and I'm not suggesting that that's not the case, but I do think it has to be a give and take.
Exactly right. It's amazing how much we blame this generation for the things we are doing to them.
Right. Yes.
And the parents are like, my kid needs to be challenged. I'm like, cool, I'll challenge your kid.
Challenge.
And then your kid comes home upset because they got challenged. And they're like, stop that immediately. Yes. No. You have made this bed and now we will slumber in it.
Right. I always tell parents, especially when I talk to families during parent night or family nights, I always say, like, I'm a mom of 3 kids who are almost all grown now. My daughter's a senior, and then that's going to be it for us. We have one who graduated college, one who's in college, and I look back on those moments because I did that. I remember going to a teacher when my oldest was in 2nd grade and being so ticked that teacher how dare she give him an 89, right? How dare she? And I was so mad. And now I look back at that moment and just cringe because I'm like, man, I spent so much of that time in my life focused on what other people were doing wrong instead of realizing that it was an opportunity for my kid to grow. And now that my kids are adults, and, I learned that as they got older. And so a lot of that became more the as I began to lean into productive struggle, my poor kids were like, what is happening? What happened to our protective mom? Like, I'm just going to let
I'm helping you, I promise.
Right. And so I think, though, that I always want to tell families, like, I recognize that it is hard. I know that as a parent, it is the hardest thing in the world to watch your kids struggle. It really is. But the reality is that if we don't give them an opportunity to do that, we aren't giving them the opportunity to build those muscles that they're going to need beyond the walls of the classroom. And I always tell parents, you can thank me now or thank me later, right? But the reality is, if struggle doesn't happen while they have a support system, it means it's going to happen. It's coming for them at some point. And so if it doesn't happen while they have a support system, it's going to happen when they don't have a support system. That's a terrible idea, right? For a kid to experience struggle for the first time when they don't have a support system, it's a recipe for disaster, for sure. I'm sure you would agree, Matt, right?
1,000%.
Okay.
Better to learn it now. So, I mean, I just feel so inspired by this. It makes me want to go back into the classroom.
Me too.
So we're going to wrap up with our final questions. So Andy, I'll start off. If you could have one superhero in the world on speed dial, who would it be and why?
Oh, that's good. I think it would be, this is going to be super boring, but I think it would be Superman, because I just always think about that scene where he would he would go into the telephone booth or whatever. And then sometimes I'm not like a big Superman. It was at Lois Lane. Was that her name? Like he would grab her, and the night that they flew over the city. Like I remember just thinking as a kid, like, I want to do that. Like I want somebody to just come scoop me up out of the kitchen while I'm making dinner. And I just want to like fly over the city and like see all the things. And so I think if I could have somebody on speed dial, number one, I think it would be very cool to know somebody who still uses a phone booth. And number two, I would love to, as weird as it is, like, I think it would be super fun to just like, hey, let's just spend a night flying over the city. So weird, I'm aware, but that's the one. You asked, that's the answer.
I think we have very different definitions of weird, because that sounds awesome.
Okay, good.
All right, Jake, go for it, bud.
I also just like the definitions of weird for that 100%. I would do the exact same thing.
Okay.
If I knew Superman, I would definitely call him and be like, can we go fly around the Philadelphia skyline for a little bit or something?
Yes.
So it's absolutely understandable.
Oh, good.
But my question for you is, what's your favorite word and why?
Oh gosh. Oh, this is gonna be hard. Okay, I think my favorite word is probably, I just thought of this the other day. I was thinking about, okay, I have two favorite words. Can I share two, or is that breaking a rule?
It's breaking a rule, but it's, perfectly fine.
So what's going to happen, right? Delete the podcast. We're done. Okay. So I was sharing with some teachers yesterday about how I think that for me as an educator, I really struggled sometimes with like always wanting to get to my goal. Like I always wanted it to be a touchdown, and I still struggle with that. I think, Matt, even in the work that we do, like if I walk away from an event and it wasn't like, oh, I got everybody excited, everybody wants to do this, then I feel like I was a failure. And so I've really been focusing lately. I shared this on Instagram recently and with the teachers yesterday on this idea of yards gained, because I was watching football with my husband the other day, and I realized that the audience or the fans get excited every time the ball moves forward. Like it's not about, oh, you didn't score a touchdown, so nobody's going to cheer. They don't just sit there. Like every time there are yards gained, there is excitement. And I don't think we do that enough in education. I think we've got to stop focusing on the touchdown while we're moving toward that maybe. I think we've got to focus on yards gained. So I even found myself last night on my drive home. I had so many conversations, whether it be on a phone call or email or whatever. And I just ended almost every conversation with like yards gained, right? Like, and so I'm really working on that vocabulary with myself every time I do something that moves the needle forward, even if it's just a little tiny bit, just in my brain, just being like yards gained, right? Maybe not a touchdown, but yards gained. So those are my words right now, yards gained. The hashtag, it's one word, so if that counts.
That's fair. It's definitely one word then.
Okay.
But I definitely love that. And personally, I think it's even like harder in American society when we're constantly told and taught, even from when we're like, little tiny babies, that you have to have the product, the end result. Like, what's the thing you're working towards, not what's the process to get there, which kind of goes back into like everything you've just been talking about as well.
Yeah. And so I would challenge you today, Jake, and you too, Matt, to like just find a way today to say that to yourself, like yards gained. I already said it to myself this morning. Like I got out of bed, I was like, yards gained, right? Like feet are on the floor, yards gained. So,
well, that is a fabulous thing to wrap this episode up with. So for everybody here at Nerding Out on Neurodiversity, I'm Dr. Matt Zakreski. Always with me is Jake Noonan. We're going to go out there and gain some yards. Andi, thank you so much. I'll see you in person very soon, okay?
yes, perfect. Thank you, Matt.
Bye, everybody.
Bye. Take care.
Nerding Out on Neurodiversity is brought to you by Dr. Matt Zakreski and the team at the Neurodiversity Collective. To learn more about the Neurodiversity Collective or to be a guest on the podcast, please visit our website at www.theneurodiversitycollective.com/podcast. Audio and production by Jake Noonan. Show your support by subscribing, leaving a 5-star review, and telling your friends about us. Our Instagram and social media handles are at #NoonPodcast, NOON Podcast. Your support is appreciated and keeps us going. All discussions presented on this podcast are strictly for informational purposes, awareness, and understanding. The advice presented is not and should not be considered to be therapeutic in nature. If you have any mental health questions, please contact your provider. All rights reserved.